Hi everyone, so here is our final formative of the semester number one. Best of luck with this. So two things that were when we prepare for, if you're preparing for the Harkness discussion on Thursday, which is part one of your final. Part two will be not this week, but not next week, not Tuesday, the, I don't know, was it like 10th or 11th, but the week afterwards, right, the week of finals, which that will start either at 7:30 if anyone wants it that early, or at 8 o'clock in the morning, and that will be a 35 question um, multiple choice exam. But part number one is the Harkness discussion, and two at least of the questions will be about the following. First of all, we talked about this in class: turning away and a turning towards. What is the kind of world or person or kind of understanding of God attempts to go to all of humanity, but we see a turn. We're going to see a turn as God approaches a single person, Avraham. And the question is, we don't quite know why God is turning towards Abraham, but we get a sense of what it is that's not working for God. And our evidence is obviously these different parts of the story, and each of them are kind of up for grabs as far as helping us understand what God is turning away from. And your goal will be to try to find a linkage between kind of the different stories. Secondly, the other question that we want to look at is this one. So, Robert Alter asked this question: what is the story that the Torah is trying to tell us? This is a slide from earlier on. And as Alter's idea is the following: God has an aim or a purpose, but those who are actively involved in bringing about those aims and purposes are actual human beings who are just way messier than we wish they were. Okay, so that will be a question we'll ask as well, and we'd like to see examples for that. Number two, there's a tension between divine orderly plan and disorderly characters. Evidence for that: God's promise and the failure of it being fulfilled. God's will and purpose and requirements versus human freedom to follow or stray. So I think this one right here is a little bit, we haven't seen that completely yet, but at least the two other ones. So there's some good questions there. All right, let's go with our class for today. First of all, we talked about a chiasm that exists in the Tower of Babel story, and of course, that is not the first time we have seen chiastic structure. We also saw it as part of the Noah's Ark story, with the numbers going down and then going back up, and one being showing a very passive Noah, one showing a very active Noah. So here we have a great situation where we have this ABCCBA, and we have this middle point in the middle that we're kind of now knowing, oh, that's kind of the main point, right? So everything's like a little bit of a mountain. Oh, like a Mount Sinai kind of. Okay. So let's just look at that for a second, because it's going to give us this kind of the crux of where the story of Bavel is. And so here is, right, these all kind of link up with each other, but then we have this piece in the middle. God came down to look at the city and tower and that man had built, and God said, if as one people in one language for all, this is how they've begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. So what is actually God worried about here? And interestingly enough, we've heard this idea before. Where have we heard that before? Right. And of course, we've heard that in the Garden of Eden, right? And the Lord said, now that man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, what if he should stretch out his hands and take also from the tree of life and eat forever? So Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to till the soil from which he was taken. Isn't that weird that that's in singular here? Whereas it should be saying them. So interesting. I personally would like a few more kind of distinct word echoes. Like it's like the same idea, but I'd love to see some kind of words being the same. And of course, one thing we did see was when he called the people of Bavel B'nai Ha'adam, right, the children of the guy named Adam, right, which is like a great little hint And Edric also brought up the hint of the let us, kind of like the let us make God, let us make people in our image, this kind of joining let us, right? So those give us kind of hints also to the Garden of Eden story. So we see very similar ideas here. What is that similar idea that God is afraid of? And how does God react? What is God's solution for dealing with that fear that God has, right? Right. I think that's kind of important. Okay. So then let's see if we can fill this out. So if creation story number 1 equals creation story number 2, right? So if creation story number 1, the Garden of Eden, it equals the creation story number 2, the flood and Noah, then the Garden of Eden story number 1 equals what we might call the Garden of Eden story number 2. What might we now consider to be the Garden of Eden story 2? Oh my goodness, right? Now let's try that for a second and let's kind of ask the question, looking back at the Tower of Bavel, the Migdal Bavel story, or the story of the city of Bavel, and just ask the question, what are the similarities between the Garden of Eden story and now the Tower of Bavel story? Tell me some examples of some similarities. Okay. Daniel brought this question up a long time ago, and kol hakavod, Daniel, because you brought this up kind of early on, like this idea of being scattered or banished or scattered is a blessing that God says to Noah and that God says to Adam and Eve. And all of a sudden, we see here at the very end of the story of Migdal Bavel, we see something else happening. Because if we look at this story right here, we have we have this being said to the first humans. Is this a blessing or a curse? Now we have this being said to Noah. Is this a blessing or a curse? And then we have this said about the city. Is this a blessing or a curse? Right? So how can it be that the exact same thing, which is basically spread out, how can it be that for two groups, that for two people, that's considered a blessing, and for these people of Bavel, it's considered a curse, right? Right? How can that be? What's going on here? Okay. So interestingly enough, right? So if let's remember what Rashi said about the tower, about the Migdal Bavel in general, right? He said two things, right? What are the two things? Read those things, things that he says, and make sure you tell me what Rashi is saying about why this tower and why the tower up to heaven. But then we have the Rashbam right here saying, wait a second. Actually, I'm not quite sure if Rashi is correct, and here's the problem. The problem is that there's a tower. If Rashi is correct, that the problem with the Bavel in general is this tower that is kind of a symbol of war or a symbol of trying to control and limit God in some way, then why is it that at the end of the story, what should we see what should we see happening? Right? We should see actually that they stop building the tower, that the tower is actually destroyed in this process. But really we see that it's the city that is stopping to be built. The tower in itself isn't even mentioned here. And so here's what the Rashbam says. So read over what the Rashbam says and tell me what the Rashbam is saying is the problem, the main thing that the people of Bavel did that were wrong. And he says it's not the tower, it's something completely else. And we know this because the punishment is the fulfillment of God's attempt to do what? To re-establish the blessing, and only the people of Bavel view that blessing as a curse. So here's the question. Why might God think it is a blessing for people to be scattered? So think about that question for a second. So I asked this question many years ago to a group of people taking the class. I think Yossi, I think your sister was in the class at that point, and we asked the following question: why might God thinks it's a blessing to be scattered? And here's the answers that they came up with. Right, a scattered people equals a different people. Other ideas and perspectives once you have diversity, possibility of other groups being created, and maybe one of those groups is the Jewish people. Um, and and so here, this actually answer came from Amitai Bader's brother Yishai, and I have a little riff on this question, right? So up until now, God has tried to come to an entire world as a whole, and we're now going to see a switch. God will switch to one person and one family. So what is it that scattering might do if we know that God is not coming to everyone anymore, but is actually coming to wants to now say, that's just not working. I'm going to try one family. So what does that allow once people are scattered? What does that allow God to do that maybe God wasn't able to do before? And how might that be actually a good strategy for God? Okay. Lastly, we're going to see very soon this beginning phrase to Avraham. God said to Avraham, "Go for yourself from your land, from your birthplace, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." Avraham went forth. By the way, his name will become Avraham, but that doesn't happen until we're kind of into the story. So my question here is, might there be a connection between the Tower of Bavel story and the one that follows? And just by looking at the two things that are highlighted here, how do those two ideas connect or not connect? This is A, this is B. How does it connect? How does it not connect with the story of Bavel? So is it? I guess the next question is like, is it so strange that the story of Bavel happens and now we see these two ideas being mentioned by God? Explain, right? Strange, not strange, and why? Okay, and does it? Okay, good. Okay. Now I want to look again. Judy Klitzner, who we've seen so much of this semester in a great way, is going to offer us kind of a really interesting idea. And she says, let's look again at why the people of Shinar did not want to scatter. Okay, and she says the following. She says, well, let's look at it. So it says, everyone on earth had with the same language and one plan, or Dvarim Achadim, right? One thing, right? We had lots of different kind of ways of translating those words, Dvarim Achadim. And certainly that'll probably be a question on your final. Okay, come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens in order to make a name for ourselves, or else we will be scattered all over the world. So that word name, right? That word is shame, and by the way, right. Interesting. We'll get to it in a second. So that is name. So not scattering will make it easier for us to make a name for ourselves. This is what the people of Bavel are saying. Okay, and okay. So here's that, right? We'll make a name for ourselves. So what's strange about this is, so we have this. Right after the story of Bavel, we have this right here. And there are two things that I think, if we view the story of the pre-story of Bavel, the motivation of Bavel for them to make a shame, there are two things that are really interesting, or that would make you wonder. So the blue here is kind of, we're calling that the whole story of Bavel, and this is the last line, right? They confuse the language. And then this kind of stuff happens next. So what's interesting about what happens not during the Bavel story, but after the Bavel story, okay? Related to right, related to kind of the motivation that they wanted right here. Okay, okay, and now really what we want to do is actually now kind of look. So here's the pre-Tower of Babel story. Here's the Tower of Babel story. Here's the post-Tower of Babel story. And what I'd like you to do for a second is to tell me the number of people's names, people who are named in the pre-Tower of Babel story. Okay, that's A. Now I want you to tell me how many names are in the post Tower of Bavel story. Okay. And by the way, also take into account there is the word shame means name, but it's also the name of actually a person is named Shame. Okay. And we see that now what I'd like you to do is tell me the number of names that are actually in the Tower of Bavel, the Migdal Bavel story itself. How many names are there? Okay. Do you see something interesting going on? Can you comment on that for a second? Okay. Because Judy Klitzner asks us to look at the amount of names that are in the pre-story, and we kind of say to ourselves, wow, the objective of God to have people scatter and have people to become different and have people to differentiate and have people to kind of create their own lives in their own places is really strong. The post Tower of Babel story also has these names that are mentioned, and wow, that feels pretty good too. Not quite as good as pre, but the post story is pretty good. But what about the story of Bavel itself? What's going on there? The very thing that they wanted to do was make a name for ourselves, and yet in the story of Bavel, there are no names, right? Why are there no names? What is a society? What kind of society is it that has no names, where everyone's identity is in some way subsumed or taken away by the identity of the collective? And so isn't that interesting, right? And so right, so the question is, how can it be that the very place that they want to create a name, there are no names at all? But the stories that come before and after are filled with names, and even filled with a person whose name is name, right? That's a little crazy, right? Okay, and here is what Judy says at the end. The Tower of Bavel story is surrounded on all sides by lists of names, yet the Bavel story presents a group of unnamed builders. These builders are trying to get famous not because of their individuality and individual efforts, but because of their collective identity. The story of Bavel describes a human tendency towards conformity. It concludes that this kind of behavior moves us away from God and makes us into a great mass of confusion, a great Babel, right? It's pretty neat. Very, very interesting. All right. We're going to move on right now to this will bleed a little bit into Monday as well, because we're moving now to the story of Avraham. Now, Avraham is not mentioned in the story in Migdal Bavel, although if we look at the years when he is around, it seems to be he would be alive. And so there's a couple midrashim that actually place Avraham as kind of walking by the Tower of Bavel, and maybe we will look at that because that could give us some kind of interesting insight. Okay, so here are famous words. So just to basically summarize the famous words, the Hebrew words that we've learned this year that I want you to know. First of all, Hashomer, Hachi, Hashomer, Achi, Anochi, am I my brother's keeper, right? That is phrase number one. The phrase number two that I had you, which were kind of two together, was Lo Bashamayim He, right? The rules are not in heaven. God bud out, you gave us the rules. And God saying, Nitzchuni banai, and laughing, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. I wish actually we also had some of the very first words that God says to Avraham. It gets to Adam, which is ayeka, right? I wish that was a word that we had to memorize as well, and said ayeka, because I love that idea of where are you? And uh, Martin Buber, one of the great Jewish philosophers of all time, said that is the question that is asked to all of us at all times by God. Where are you? Not geographically, but physically. Okay, so I like that term, ayeka. Oh, maybe you can learn it now. Okay, so good. Okay, so we'll put it on the list. So now we've got Hashomer Achi Anochi, am I my brother's keeper? Lo b'shamayim hi, right? That's not in the Torah, but it's in the Talmud, right? It's not in heaven. Nitzchuni banai, God talking, saying, my children have defeated me, my children have defeated me. Ayeka, God asking Adam, Harishon, the first guy, where are you? And here is your final memorizable verse for this semester. Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha u'mibeit avicha. When I was in fourth grade, in afternoon Hebrew school, I had to memorize this phrase as well. Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha u'mibeit avicha. Right? And if you need help, we can actually look at this great song by a guy named Akiva. Here we go. It's really good.
אישון ליל קבע ירח מאחורי ענן שמעת הכל מתחת לחלום הרגשת זה הזמן עוד תמעיל אל הכל כמה חפצים בתיק קטן פתק על המקרר כתבת יוצא לדרך לא יודע לאן כשזה קורה זה קורה לא צריך להתבלבל לך לך מארצך ממולדתך מבית אביך לך לך לארצך וזה נדמה עולם כמנהגו נוהג והכל קשור אבל בפנים הכל תלוי ועומד כחוט השערה אתה יודע מה שהיה לא יחזור להיות אותו הדבר עברת צד עכשיו כולם בעבר השני של הנהר כשזה קורה זה קורה לא צריך להתבלבל לך לך מארצך ממולדתך מבית אביך לך לך לארצך
Hey, you got the idea. What a beautiful song, right? Beautiful song. Akiva Meturgaman, I think. Okay, so here we have the next phrase, right? God says, "Go lecha," and I don't want to translate lecha quite now because I think we're going to get to that a little bit later. God says to Avraham, remember his name will become Avraham later. God says to Avraham, "Go lecha from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." Avraham went forth. And so the quick question that we'll need to ask, of course, is why Avraham? What do we know about Avraham that makes us say, oh, I get it. I know why Avraham was chosen among all others. Now, one thing we could do is obviously look at the structure of events going on. We've got the 10 begats from Adam to Noah. We've got Noah, flood, and kind of almost a rebirth with a re-blessing. Then we get 10 begats again, right, from Shem to Avraham. and then we have Avram. So maybe Avram is supposed to be like this, right? It's supposed to be like this Noah flood rebirth, right? Okay, and so maybe we get kind of a sense. So if that's all we had, what might kind of be kind of the reason why Avram? Okay, okay, and right. So here is let's also kind of sense take a look at what we do know about Abraham, kind of the pre-story. So first of all, we know that Abraham's going to come from this guy named Shem. It's kind of that line here, and Eber was fathered Peleg, and let's just see what happens next. And here is the rest of this story. And so this is really all we know about the Avraham pre-Lech Lecha. Okay, so what in here have we learned about Avram, and how might what we like what do we so give me some facts that we know about Avram, and how might those facts um, tell us why God picked Avram opposed to anyone else, right? Okay, interesting. Okay. Um, and now, just to make matters worse, let's contrast this guy with the guy from 10 generations ago, right? Where we have all of these things about Noah that's said about Noah. And of course, we questioned kind of how accurate some of these ideas were, just how righteous Noah was, if it says in his generation. But compared to Avram, if we were to kind of do a scorecard, what would be the score we would give Noah as far as someone that God should contact and say, you can be like the father of a new nation? And what's the score you would give to Avram as someone that God would say, oh, this could be a good person? So it really begs the question, right? Why Avram? And it makes you think that it feels very random, or maybe even that God has made a bad choice. And of course, this is the moment because we have a big philosophical question. Midrash will come to the rescue. And so let's just recall once again how Midrash happens. So right now we already have the big philosophical question that's kind of floating around, which is why Avram? But then there has to be a weirdness about the Torah text. And the question is, have we seen a weirdness? If this is all the Torah text we have about Avram, have we seen a weirdness here? So this is what James Kugel says, right? Readers of these opening words were disturbed by them, for the Bible has just now begun Avram's story, and suddenly God is promising that he will be blessed, that he will found a great nation, and so forth. What has Avram done to deserve these things? Moreover, if God was so pleased with Avram, why did he begin by telling him to leave his homeland? To leave one's homeland meant leaving the security of family and friends and becoming a defenseless wanderer. If God had truly wished to bless Avram and grant him all manners of good things, wouldn't God have at least have allowed him to stay where he was? At least try to answer the second question, right? Why does God say you have to go? But so again, so here are the big kind of philosophical questions that we might have, but the largest one obviously is why Abraham. And so here is where James Kugel, the Harvard biblical scholar, kind of says that they tried to find the place where they could hook on to some ideas about why Avraham. And again, the problem is in the Torah itself, we just don't have enough information that says, yes, this is the guy for us, right? But right after the Torah ends, right, the Torah ends with the people kind of with one foot getting ready to go over into the promised land, and that's when the Torah ends. But the book right after that is the book of Joshua. And here's Joshua. Joshua has 24 chapters, and in that final chapter, right, so the book of Joshua is about the conquering of the land of Canaan, the land of the future land of Israel. And in the 24th chapter, the final chapter, it has these words right here. And in these words, we have the first time we have someone, Joshua, reflecting upon Avram and contrasting and comparing him to his brothers, to others, right? So there it is right there. And what I want you to see is what can you isolate from this description of Avraham, the only description we have really of Avraham. Maybe there's one more slight reference also in not in the Torah itself, but what might we start what might be an opening here for like what are we're gonna start asking some questions that might give us through midrash some answers, right? So and so that's kind of our final step of today. Great, thanks.